So, as I said, today we're going to cover another chapter or portion of the book of this book titled Where the Carcass Is. It's been a pretty interesting study so far. It's a different twist on a view of the nation of Israel, including the houses of Joseph and Judah. And we kind of skipped over the chronology of the different tribes of Israel and where they ended up. We will come back to that. But I think most of us here today understand that the Western world, the United States, Britain, France, the Danes, they are descendants, Australia, Canada, obviously, descendants of the 12 tribes of Israel. And so I didn't want to delve too much into that just yet. So what I want to do, I want to read through the book of Ezekiel, chapters 37 through 39 first. And that will that'll be the introduction really to this study. And again, this is meant to be more of an open study, open discussion. So if you have questions or you would like to raise any points, please, feel free to do so. I don't want to monopolize all the time. So feel free to jump in when you need to. So and I'm sharing eSword, so hopefully you can see that. And we'll be reading through, as I said, Ezekiel, if you want to follow along, chapters 37 through 39. And Ezekiel 37 starts out with the Valley of Dry Bones. And it says in verse 1, "The hand of Yehovah was upon me, and he brought me out in the spirit of Yehovah and set me down in the middle of the valley. It was full of bones. And he led me around among them, and behold, there were very many on the surface of the valley, and behold, they were very dry. And he said to me, Son of man, can these bones live? And I answered, O Adonai Yehovah, you know. And he said to me, Prophesy over these bones and say to them, O dry bones, hear the word of Yehovah. Thus says Adonai Yehovah to these bones, Behold, I will cause breath to enter you, and you shall live. And I will lay sinews upon you, and will cause flesh to come upon you, and cover you with skin, and put breath in you, and you shall live. And you shall know that I am Yehovah. So I prophesied as I was commanded, and as I prophesied, there was a sound, and behold, a rattling, and the bones came together, bone to its bone. And I looked, and behold, there were sinews on them, and flesh had come upon them, and skin had covered them, but there was no breath in them. Verse 9, Then he said to me, Prophesy to the breath. Prophesy, Son of man, and say to the breath, Thus says Adonai Yehovah, Come from the four winds, O breath, and breathe on these slain that they may live. So I prophesied as he commanded me, and the breath came into them, and they lived and stood on their feet, an exceedingly great army. Then he said to me, Son of man, these bones are the whole house of Israel. Behold, they say, Our bones are dried up, and our hope is lost. We are indeed cut off. Therefore prophesy and say to them, Thus says Adonai Yehovah, Behold, I will open your graves and raise you from your graves, O my people, and I will bring you into the land of Israel. And you shall know that I am Yehovah, when I open your graves and raise you from your graves, O my people. And I will put my spirit within you, and you shall live, and I will place you in your own land. Then you shall know that I am Yehovah. I have spoken, and I will do it, declares Yehovah. The word of Yehovah came to me, Son of man. Take a stick and write on it, for Judah and the people of Israel associated with him. Then take another stick and write on it, for Joseph, the stick of Ephraim, and all the house of Israel associated with him. And remember, before we talked about these 12 tribes of Israel falling under the protection of two houses, Joseph and Judah. And here we see the same concept being described. In verse 17, he says, and join them one to another into one stick, that they may become one in your hand. And when your people say to you, will you not tell us what you mean by these? Say to them, thus says Adonai Yehovah, behold, I am about to take the stick of Joseph, that is, in the hand of Ephraim, and the tribes of Israel associated with him, and I will join with it the stick of Judah, and make them one stick, that they may be one in my hand. When the sticks on which you write are in your hand before their eyes, then say to them, thus says Adonai Yehovah, behold, I will take the people of Israel from the nations among which they have gone, and will gather them from all around and bring them to their own land. And I will make them one nation in the land, on the mountains of Israel, and one king shall be king over them all, and they shall be no longer two nations, no longer divided into two kingdoms. They shall not defile themselves anymore with their idols and their detestable things, or with any of their transgressions, but I will save them from all of the backslidings in which they have sinned, and will cleanse them, and they shall be my people, and I will be their God. Verse 24, my servant David shall be king over them, and they shall have one shepherd. They shall walk in my rules and be careful to obey my statutes. They shall dwell in the land that I gave to my servant Jacob, where your fathers lived. They and their children and their children's children shall dwell there forever, and David my servant shall be their prince forever. Now it's interesting to note that in this time that is being spoken of here, people are going to be careful to obey the law of God. Yet today they say, the law of God's done away with. It's of no consequence because we're under grace. I don't think so. Verse 26, I will make a covenant of peace with them. It shall be an everlasting covenant with them, and I will set them in their land and multiply them, and will set my sanctuary in their midst forevermore. My dwelling place shall be with them, and I will be their Elohim, and they shall be my people. Then the nations will know that I am Yehovah who sanctifies Israel, when my sanctuary is in their midst forevermore. Moving on to chapter 38. Verse 1, the word of Yehovah came to me, Son of man, set your face toward Gog, of the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, and prophesy against him, and say, thus says Adonai Yehovah, behold, I am against you, O Gog, chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, and I will turn you about and put hooks into your jaws, and I will bring you out, and all your army, horses and horsemen, all of them clothed in full armor, a great host, all of them with buckler and shield, wielding swords. Persia, Cush, and Put are with them, all of them with shield and helmet. Gomer and all his hordes, Beth Togarmah, from the uttermost parts of the north, with all his hordes, many peoples are with you. Be ready and keep ready, you and all your hosts that are assembled about you, and be a guard for them. After many days you will be mustered. In the latter days you will go against the land that is restored from war, the land whose people were gathered from many peoples, among the mountains of Israel, which had been a continual waste. Its people were brought out from the peoples and now dwell securely, all of them. You will advance, coming on like a storm. You will be a cloud covering the land, you and all your hordes, and many peoples with you. Thus says Adonai Yehovah, on that day, thoughts will come into your mind, and you will devise an evil scheme, and say, I will go up against the land of unwalled villages. I will fall upon the quiet people who dwell securely, all of them dwelling without walls and having no bars or gates, to seize, spoil, and carry off plunder, to turn your hand against the waste places that are now inhabited, and the people who were gathered from the nations, who have acquired livestock and goods, who dwell at the center of the earth. Sheba and Dedan and the merchants of Tarshish and all its leaders will say to you, have you come to seize spoil? Have you assembled your host to carry off plunder, to carry away silver and gold, to take away livestock and goods, to seize great spoil? Therefore, Son of Man, prophesy and say to Gog, and thus says Adonai Yehovah, on that day, when my people Israel are dwelling securely, will you not know it? You will come from your place, out of the uttermost parts of the north, you and many peoples with you, all of them riding on horses, a great host, a mighty army. You will come up against my people Israel like a cloud covering the land. In the latter days I will bring you against my land, that the nations may know me, when through you, O God, I vindicate my holiness before their eyes. Thus says Adonai Yehovah, are you he of whom I spoke in former days by my servants, the prophets of Israel, who in those days prophesied for years that I would bring you against them? But on that day, the day that Gog shall come against the land of Israel, declares Adonai Yehovah, my wrath will be roused in my anger. For in my jealousy and in my blazing wrath I declare, on that day there shall be a great earthquake in the land of Israel. The fish of the sea and the birds of the heavens and the beasts of the field and all creeping things that creep on the ground, and all the people who are on the face of the earth shall quake at my presence, and the mountains shall be thrown down, and the cliffs shall fall, and every wall shall tumble to the ground. I will summon a sword against Gog on all my mountains, declares Adonai Yehovah. Every man's sword will be against his brother. With pestilence and bloodshed I will enter into judgment with him, and I will rain upon him and his hordes, and the many peoples who are with him, torrential rains and hailstones, fire and sulfur. So I will show my greatness and my holiness, and make myself known in the eyes of many nations. Then they will know that I am Yehovah. This theme, then they will know that I am Yehovah, runs throughout this. It is only through absolute catastrophe and being brought to the brink of death that man recognizes his creator. Moving on, chapter 39. And you, son of man, prophesy against Gog and say, thus says Adonai Yehovah, behold, I am against you, O Gog, chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, and I will turn you about and drive you forward and bring you up from the uttermost parts of the north and lead you against the mountains of Israel. Then I will strike your bow from your left hand and will make your arrows drop out of your right hand. You shall fall on the mountains of Israel, you and all your hordes and the peoples who are with you. I will give you to birds of prey of every sort and to the beasts of the field to be devoured. You shall fall in the open field, for I have spoken, declares Adonai Yehovah. I will send fire on Magog and all those who dwell securely in the coastlands, and they shall know that I am Yehovah. And my holy name I will make known in the midst of my people Israel, and I will not let my holy name be profaned any more. And the nations shall know that I am Yehovah, the Holy One of Israel. Behold, it is coming, and it will be brought about, declares Adonai Yahovah. That is the day of which I have spoken. Then those who dwell in the cities of Israel will go out and make fires of the weapons and burn them, shields and bucklers, bows and arrows, clubs and spears. They will make fires for them for 7 years, so that they will not heed or not need to take wood out of the field or cut down any out of the forest, for they will make their fires of the weapons. They will seize the spoil of those who despoiled them and plunder those who plundered them, declares Adonai Yahovah. On that day I will give to Gog a place for burial in Israel, the valley of the travelers, east of the sea. It will block the travelers, for there Gog and all his multitude will be buried. It will be called the valley of Hamon Gog. For 7 months the house of Israel will be burying them in order to cleanse the land. And all the people of the land will bury them, and it will bring them renown on the day that I show my glory, declares Adonai Yahovah. They will set apart men to travel through the land regularly and bury those travelers remaining on the face of the land so as to cleanse it. At the end of 7 months, they will make their search. And when these travel through the land, and anyone sees a human bone, then he shall set up a sign by it, till the buriers have buried it in the valley of Hamon Gog. Hamonah is also the name of the city. Thus shall they cleanse the land. Verse 17, As for you, son of man, thus says Adonai Yahovah, speak to the birds of every sort, and to all beasts of the field, assemble and come, gather from all around to the sacrificial feast that I am preparing for you, a great sacrificial feast on the mountains of Israel, and you shall eat flesh and drink blood. You shall eat the flesh of the mighty and drink the blood of the princes of the earth, of rams, of lambs, and of he-goats, of bulls, and of them, all of them, fat beasts of Bashan. And you shall eat fat till you are filled, and drink blood till you are drunk at the sacrificial feast that I am preparing for you. And you shall be filled at my table with horses and charioteers, with mighty men of all kinds of warriors, declares Adonai Yahovah. And I will set my glory among the nations, and all the nations shall see my judgment that I have executed, and my hand that I have laid on them. The house of Israel shall know that I am Yehovah, their Elohim, from that day forward. And the nations shall know that the house of Israel went into captivity for their iniquity, because they dealt so treacherously with me that I hid my face from them and gave them into the hand of their adversaries, and they all fell by the sword. I dealt with them according to their uncleanness and their transgressions, and hid my face from them. Continuing on in verse 25, Therefore, thus says Adonai Yahovah, now I will restore the fortunes of Jacob, and have mercy on the whole house of Israel, and I will be jealous for my holy name. They shall forget their shame and all the treachery they have practiced against me, when they dwell securely in their land with none to make them afraid. And when I have brought them back from the peoples and gathered them from their enemies' lands, and through them have vindicated my holiness in the sight of many nations, then they shall know that I am Yehovah, their Elohim, because I sent them into exile among the nations, and then assembled them into their own land. I will leave none of them remaining among the nations any more, and I will not hide my face any more from them when I pour out my spirit upon the house of Israel, declares Adonai Yahovah. So these are prophecies about Israel and Judah. And in order to cross-check the prophecies of Daniel in chapter 11 of the book of Daniel and its end time verses, we have to compare it to these verses in Ezekiel so that it gives clarity and understanding of this yet future history. Let me share my screen. So I'm just trying to share my PowerPoint. There we go. So Ezekiel gives us, hold one second, please. Oh, there we go. I just want to get the chat window over here so I can see what people are saying in case. Okay, I think. Yeah, it does. Most of us have believed that, Doug, that these events were post-White Throne Judgment. But I think the position of the writer is that this is not post-White Throne Judgment. So we'll, as we go along here, we'll get clarity on that. So Ezekiel kind of gives us a condensed picture of the historical story about the 2 feet and the 10 toes of iron and clay of Nebuchadnezzar's dream, that image in his dream that we read about in Daniel. And these 2 feet became the 5th ruling power on the world stage. 1 foot became the United Kingdom and into the superpower of the British Empire. And the 2nd foot became the superpower of the United States of America. And with both of these powers rising out of the 10 toes of iron and clay. The clay was for molding of the tribes of Israel under the blessings for the last days, headed by Ephraim, which is the UK or Great Britain, and Manasseh, which is the United States. And Ezekiel tells us how all of this happened. And he paints a very descriptive picture showing these branches of tribes going all over the sea, over the seawall of Britain, from Genesis 48, 1 through 20, and Genesis 49, verse 22. And then from there being spread abroad through prosperity. You can see that in Zechariah 1:17. Now, the historical picture unraveling in Ezekiel should bring about a thought in our head of the happenings of bygone times and the beginnings of that power of the 2 feet being molded throughout history. The first foot to come onto the world stage with power that Ezekiel acknowledges is the United States, because it is Manasseh first, son of Joseph, which prophecy begins with in Ezekiel 38, 8, and 9. And there are only a few Bible students or church denominations that have pronounced that Russia is the oncoming terror upon the Middle East, etc. Right? So a lot of the churches of God have talked about Gog and Magog being Russia. So they are out there, but they stop short at interpreting words for the end time for Europe as a whole and the United States. There's a book titled The Beginning of the End by Tim LaHaye. And there's a good summary in this book of Ezekiel's prophecy of events with Russia going into the land of Israel and Palestine. There are several other writings questioning Russia's motives along the same lines in this area of the world. The Christadelphians see Russia coming down with awesome power into the Middle East. And these writers have gone to a lot of trouble to explain the ancient names from Ezekiel given for these nations today. And much of what they've written in a roundabout way is correct. But they begin to flounder in their interpretations of some of the prophetic verses, especially within Ezekiel. And these mistakes originate from one simple conclusion, that they have not correctly translated all preceding verses in Daniel's historical chapter 11. Therefore, they fall apart in cross-checking with other prophetic chapters. And this makes a big difference to the end-time history of those verses given in Daniel and Ezekiel and other prophets. For instance, not one writer amongst many emphatically states the fact that World War I and II is prophesied and given in detail in Daniel chapter 11. And neither do they give the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70, nor the birth of the vision of our Lord, of Jesus the Christ. They are so busy digging around with secular history of Antiochus Epiphanes, who lived centuries ago, instead of World Wars I and II overflow each other, and then they subtly overflow right into World War III. So if we read an excerpt from the book mentioned earlier, this end time, what was it called? It's called Beginning of the End. So, in the beginning of the end, Tim LaHaye states this. He says, the sobering conclusion is this: many of the African nations will be united and allied with the Russians in the invasion of Israel. This is in accord with Daniel's graphic description of this invasion from Daniel 11:36 through 45. Here, the Russian force is called the King of the North, and the African Cush is called the King of the South. So here we have another interpretation of kings of the North and South, differing from some other denominations and their writers. We begin to have problems, which then upsets the factual continuing story of secular history throughout time given by prophecy. Daniel 11:36, quoted by Tim LaHaye, is he doesn't seem to understand or see that he's dealing with the magnification of a man called Hitler in World War II. So this writer believes that Daniel 11:36 is in reference to World War II and Hitler. which included the indignation or Holocaust of the Jewish nation and war with British Israelite stock. World War II spills over into verse 40 of that chapter, chapter 11, which shows the Russian overflowing into other countries, which then begins to give us a picture of who the he is of the North. Now, this leader out of Russia, in turn, makes the rest of the verses from 41 to 45 of Daniel a descriptive absolute of the end time of history. The king of the south would then certainly not be the African nations against Hitler. That certification of the south is coming from France, south of the British Isles. Now, many Bible students like Tim LaHaye speak words, as in the quote above that we just read, of Daniel's graphic description in his prophecies. And it's not until one really unravels all of Daniel's words of verses in secular history in complete order with dates, times, peoples, events, and the cross-checking that goes on, right? You have to cross-check it against different prophecies, that you really you come to the realization of the exactness of those graphic descriptions. You start to get that historical you get these historical verses flowing in correctly, and no amount of conjecture can enter into it by anyone. You know, when you start to compare these things and you see them not lining up properly, you have to come to the realization that something is not right. An interpretation has gone awry somewhere. And if you incorrectly interpret the pivot point for north and south kings from the wrong location, then you're in trouble right from the get-go. Then the word conjecture runs onto the scene, which then brings more confusion with those who are trying to understand biblical prophecy. And this is why the verses in Daniel telling us important events in secular history nail down the compass points upon the British Isles, apart from the land of Israel and Palestine, until you begin to understand by exercising your mind, you begin to see prophecy gradually fall into place. So through the last chapter of Daniel, you see different versions of north and south kings from different writers of biblical scripture. How then is Scripture able to settle the question for us and put a nail in that particular question? So the first step to this question is overcoming your own beliefs and predisposition or your own bias. We shouldn't be afraid to prove and test all things, to test the paths of many spirits of churches, right? What did Paul tell us? He said, test all things and hold on to that which is true. Don't be unskillful in your own thoughts and conclusions of what our end of days is, and remain that proverbial babe in the world of harsh reality. It's time for us to grow up and begin to understand these things. It's time for the meat within the oracles of God, which go back to the first principles of Scripture upon which our present learning depend, right? All of the things that we're learning now depend on those first oracles, I guess, of first principles of Scripture. Russia, within Daniel and Ezekiel, with that infamous quote-unquote he, or the king of the north, or the chief prince of Meshech, is without doubt also the rider of the pale horse of Revelation chapter 6, who brings untold misery to nations. For accepting the terrible conditions in the earth that the pale horse brings, you'll need the quick eyes and thinking of a hawk and not the flight of a dove to put your house in order. It's time for people to wake up and begin to understand the reality of what's about to happen. You know, we were talking before services started, and James was saying that people have been warned. People have been warned. We've been warned. And the warning is there in the pages of these prophets. And it's there for our understanding. And God will reveal it when we need to know it. And brethren, I think the time has come for us to start understanding these things. Now, I'm not saying I have a total understanding or, anybody spoke to me or anything like that. I'm just saying that as we begin to come across these explanations that perhaps we haven't seen before, we shouldn't be afraid of them. We should test it to see if it holds up. And that's what we're doing here today. Now, we shouldn't look at Ezekiel's prophecy as a blanket prophecy through lack of understanding the subtleties of interpretation. And we shouldn't look at it as if it's only between the house of Judah being dealt harshly by the Russian hordes. The West, which holds all of the children of the house of Israel, are within that prophecy as well, which makes the stand of the whole 12 tribes of Israel known in the earth. Now, Ezekiel's prophecies must be looked at in depth and on a wide scope, in the same manner that has been achieved with Daniel's prophecies. And this is to prove once more God rules in the kingdoms of men. God's ruling in the earth it seems God rules in the earth's secular history, and he rules in the thinking of mankind. And it seems to have either been a non-starter or kind of haphazard, this understanding. But it's really not, his ruling is not haphazard. It's actually quite the opposite. It's complex. But when you put it all in sequence of historical events made known through biblical prophecy, you can then really see fully exactly what God has done to bring nations into focus for us all to see here in the 21st century. The path of secular history is what God has done in the ebb and flow of men's power, within which he was also saving the miserable, stiff-necked lives of the two houses of Israel, bringing this whole nation through the centuries of history to its final end with eventual knowledge and understanding of his purpose, showing that his promises were indeed kept, his ancient words to the patriarchs fulfilled, and his love never ending. And his anger and chastisement were purposeful. And his purpose is not to exact vengeance. It's to correct our sinful behavior and bring us back into a reconciled state. Ezekiel's prophecies, like Daniel's prophecies, are world history, but couched and hidden in another fashion, right? These prophecies are difficult to unravel. Ezekiel gives in-depth history showing how the house of Israel, the 10 tribes, survived in the Gentile world till the end time through prosperity spoken of by Zechariah. And this exceeding great army of those quote-unquote lost children of Israel came out of that lost grave in the earth spoken by Ezekiel 37, right? Those dry bones that came up. They began standing upon their feet to begin to fight back within nations on into the 20th century, when finally all things will be understood and knowledge increased, so that the elect children of Zion within them can be awakened and saved from the destruction to come. So in that aspect, it appears that those prophecies are related more toward the 10 tribes of Israel that were sent into captivity, emerging again throughout the annals of history and becoming the Western nations, Britain, the United States, Canada, France, Denmark, and Holland, and the others. That's the flesh being put back on the bones, in this writer's opinion. Now, Ezekiel is preoccupied with Ephraim and Manasseh, which were Joseph's sons, whose special blessings, you remember, Jacob adopted Ephraim and Manasseh and bestowed blessings on them. And these special blessings gave them power of ruling within the Gentile nations and brought about the 2 feet of Daniel's image. In Ezekiel 37, we see that. And they have been nurtured by God throughout adversity, through those long years within secular history. So each powerful nation of Joseph's sons is given a separate explanation of identity, which is recorded in Ezekiel's chapters 37 to 39. Now, understanding these chapters, perhaps the deaf and blind nations of all Israel, which is both houses, will know to the full who they are. So let us pick out a few of the verses from the Bible to prove that the stand of the 12 tribes of Israel will be made known in the earth also to other peoples and nations. First, we have to look again at Ezekiel 37, which gives us the foundation stones for Ezekiel's following chapters to work on. So looking at this valley of dry bones from Ezekiel 37, 1 through 14, it's the whole house of Israel, 10 tribes in the Gentile, meaning they were absorbed into the Gentile nations, whose hope was lost. The northern kingdom of 10 tribes of Israel were called the lost sheep, from Jeremiah 50, 4 through 6, and Matthew 10, 6. The Jews have always remained an identifiable people within conquering nations, though they too had confusion of faces. right? They've been amalgamated amongst a lot of people, but they've always been identifiable. And to be a Jew was their own strength. That was their identity. So in verse 25 of Ezekiel 37, the Holy Land was given to Jacob, children of the flesh, or the Jewish people, who have indeed inherited some of the land of Israel today. Yes, Sabbath keeping was their sign. The Sabbath has always been a sign of God's people. And they've maintained it over the millennia. So they have indeed inherited some of that land today, but the rest of verse 25 is a reference to King David, which has yet to be fulfilled when it's, he sets David as king over them. And then in verse 16, that explains that these two sticks, these memory sticks, if you will, are paramount to our understanding of who we are. These two sticks are for the two houses of Israel's nation. One stick for Judah and his companions, which, as we've learned before, are Benjamin and Levi. And one stick for Joseph, who was the stick of Ephraim, or England. And they are the British modern-day royal house governing the house of Israel, with all the house of Israel and his companions, which is Manasseh, Reuben, Simeon, Zebulun, Issachar, Dan, Gad, Asher, Naphtali. Joseph's strength with God holds them together. So the promise in the last days, or in time of secular history, is again to both nations who have become identifiable in the earth. Right? In verse 22 of Ezekiel 37, it says, "And I will make them one nation, and not two nations in Jew and Gentile, as we see today." One nation in the land upon the mountains of Israel, and one king who is the shepherd who gathers them into the fold, which is the Messiah, Yahushua, Jesus. He says, "And one king shall be king to them all, and they shall be no more two nations, no more Israel and Judah. Neither shall they be divided into two kingdoms." Now the law prophesied here upon the last days of two kingdoms. One stick for the stock of the British Israelite Gentiles, one stick for the Jew in the land of Israel, etc., under the Mosaic law. And he says, "Neither shall they be divided into two kingdoms anymore at all." Now, Ezekiel's prophecies had been written when both ancient kingdoms of Israel and Judah had been deported into Assyria and Babylon. So Ezekiel isn't talking about those ancient kingdoms which had then gone, but future kingdoms into our days. To continue, we read from Ezekiel 38. "After establishing themselves there, will remain in the earth in the last days, or in time of history, two kingdoms or houses of the nation of Israel. Therefore, one kingdom had been subject to the Gentile British Isles, which Daniel has shown us throughout historical prophecy, who are inheriting, firstly, through the Spirit of Jesus, and secondly, according to the flesh, as another kingdom out of Israel, who are returning to the land of Israel. So Jacob's sons, the Jews, are sons inheriting after the laws of the flesh first, through possession of the land of Israel and not the Christ. Right? Christ came into Joseph. The Jews rejected him altogether. So Judah's rejected Christ. And when Jesus is recognized by them as the Messiah, then they inherit according to the Spirit. Right now they've inherited according to the flesh, that land of Israel over there. Both these kingdoms or nations of peoples will be attacked by the king of the north and the host of peoples he brings with him. So let's take a little bit closer look at these statements. Ezekiel 38 verse 2 says, Son of man, and that's a reference to Ezekiel, set your face against, which means to fix in general with a settled purpose, with a bold expression confronting this situation in opposition to. Set your face against Gog, the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, and prophesy against him. Now the references in Ezekiel to the names Gog, Magog, Meshech, and Tubal, all biblical scholars agree is the identification of Russia and its northern powers. Gog is the name of the callous prince or dictator of Russia. Magog is his land, which he rules, or Mother Russia, within the Asian continent. Now, others say Magog is related to the ancient Scythians who spread from the river Tanais, or Don, westward along the bank of the Ister, or the Danube. Therefore, Russia has occupied territory in Germany in the last days, and the European nations will be friendly to him when he goes to war, reluctantly or otherwise. So we see a Russia that is friendly to, or a Europe that is friendly to Russia. The reference to Meshech and Tubal are the old names for Moscow and Tobolsk. The name Meshech is the ancient name of Muscovy, from whence came the name Moscow. The name Tubal naturally suggests Tobolsky, which takes its name from the river Tobol, which has become a busy metropolis in a once almost empty Siberia. Yeah, Jerry, that could be. They could be part of those hordes that come with Gog, in reference to China, that is. So Ezekiel's identification of Russia in chapter 38 is very remarkable indeed. Because if we analyze these words properly, which were written during Ezekiel's visions many centuries ago, we read that Ezekiel was carried away captive into Babylon during the deportations of the Jews of the house of Judah, approximately 597 BC, about 8 years after Daniel was deported into Babylon. Now, at that time, Russia was a non-entity, having no kings honored by a crown. The city of Moscow as a superpower base was never heard of. Moscow, or Meshech, didn't become a principality until the 13th century AD. Because like most countries in their early years, these surges of people entered and occupied and fought within Russia for power. Not unlike what happened here in North America. And Russia itself was only a small territory, unlike what we see today. The word Tubal or Tobolsk, excuse me. Now, this word Tubal, stated with Moscow by Ezekiel, is indeed a far-sighted, amazing prophecy. Because Tobolsk is in the vast hidden land mass of Siberia. The name Siberia means the sleeping land. Yet this vast unknown region today, with Tobolsk as a river port city, is far from sleeping. Shipping, air transport, and railways have been increased because Siberia has become important for its vast wealth. While it implies or is making a case for the king of the north being Russia. The 42 months we'll get to at a later time. But yes, I think that's where it's going. So, this Tobolsk, this Siberian area, right, has pipelines for oil and gas that have been built, cutting their way through the country and down into Central Europe. Right? There was a big hubbub in the news a while back talking about Russia, Europe buying their natural gas and all of that from Russia. So, they are making inroads into Europe. And there's inland waterways that play an important role in communications within this region, which extends out into the Arctic Ocean. And they also have large deposits of coal, petroleum, diamonds, gold, and other valuable commodities. So when Ezekiel spoke of Moscow and Tobolsk, he was telling us also the extent to which the landmass of Russia would finally reach at the historical end time, showing us also that this superpower would center at Moscow, or Daniel's palace, the Kremlin at Moscow from Daniel 11:45. The place of Tobolsk within the land of Magog, where some of Russia's wealth would help to keep Russia's war machine operative. In Ezekiel 38, 4 through 6, God is fighting against the forces of the Union of Russia. He says, I will turn thee back to their own land and put hooks into your jaws, or hold them prisoner and to bait them toward destruction. If they try to break free, it's going to cause great anguish and pain. This punishment the ancient Assyrians did to their prisoners of war. He says, I will bring you forth and all your army, horses and horsemen, all of them clothed with all sorts of armor, even a great company with bucklers and shields, all of them handling swords. God is going to bring that great army forward into the valley of decision. And the deciding factor will be to end the grief that man has imposed upon peoples of all nations. And this great army will be composed of different nations, many ethnic groups dressed in many ways, but all belligerent. Sorry. Having a little technical difficulty. Bear with me for for a minute. Now in verse 5, he says, Persia, Cush or Ethiopia, and Libya or Put. With them, all of them with shield and helmet. Right? They're dressed, ready for war, yet protecting themselves at the same time. Daniel told us to expect this happening in verses 42 and 43 of chapter 11. Continuing on in verse 6, Gomer and all his bands, the house of Togarmah of the north quarters and all his hordes, many peoples are with you. Or as Daniel says, they all amalgamate through Russian subversion, infiltration, overrunning of lands in the Middle East and Europe. Now, many people will be imperial Leninist oriented and perhaps too afraid not to be, which makes the Russian form of democratic socialism as fearful as Nazism, which overran many lands before it was checked. So this movement that we see happening in the West, in the United States, a movement toward radical left socialism, communism, could very well lead to this quote-unquote invasion, right? The Russians have been saying that the communists have been predicting that they will overtake the West and never have to fire a shot, because they will infiltrate our entire governmental system. And I'm afraid that's what they've done. Historians tell us that Gomer is an ancient name, first appearing in Genesis 10, 1 through 5, being the son out of Noah's son Japheth, whose family spread out into the ancient Cimmerians and Simbi, from whom descended the Celtic families, settling eventually all over Europe and the British Isles. And then from Japheth came Madai, or the ancient Medes, settling around old Persia and Iran. And from Japheth came Javan, populating Greece and Syria, etc. From Japheth came Tubal, who inherited the Black Sea area, spreading across Siberia. From Japheth came Meshech and Tiras, or broadly speaking, peoples within Russia, a race of which went also to Spain. Tiras became the ancient Thracians. The house of Togarmah, mentioned by Ezekiel of the northern quarters, were a people out of Gomer, who traded and used horses, war horses, and mules extensively, trading them to other nations. And though their lands are shrouded in mystery, it's said that they settled from the Euphrates River to Armenia. The word bands, or hordes, associated with Gomer in Ezekiel 38:6, are companies of men binding them together for a reason or purpose. So Ezekiel is boldly saying that the chief prince of Russia has more or less dominated the world and overrun into many nations. And Daniel says Russia has achieved this through its tabernacles, aggression, subversion, or peace. So it is now poised to overrun the Holy Land where Judah resides, the USA, and the British Isles, which isles became a cradle for the whole house of Israel to mature. Just like Egypt allowed the tiny family of Israel to grow into millions of people, these isles afar off, the United States, Britain, have been havens of refuge for Israel to grow. We have yet to see that, Doug. I'm not sure how yet all of this ties into this Armageddon. I think Armageddon is post-millennial. This is pre-millennial, and Armageddon would be post-millennial. I think, like I said, that's a question that we have to decide. So continuing on into Ezekiel 38, 8, 9, he says, after many days you will be mustered. In the latter years you will go against the land that is restored from war, the land whose people were gathered from many peoples upon the mountains of Israel, which had been a continual waste. Its people were brought out from the peoples and now dwell securely, all of them. Right? He's speaking of the creation of the Western world, which was a refuge for the house of Israel. And now dwell securely, all of them. You will advance, coming on like a storm. You will be like a cloud covering the land, you and all your hordes and many peoples with you. So here we want to take a look at some of the words in these two verses. And these words will be looked at in a different way than is typical for most Bible students. These two verses are dealing with the United States of America, one of the powerful feet of iron and clay of Nebuchadnezzar's dream, that image in Nebuchadnezzar's dream that we find in Daniel's prophecy. And this is the storming of that land by Russian forces. We're dealing also with the end of man's ruling power and the beginning of all the nation of Israel's awakening, which is their destiny foretold and consummated in prophecy. If this timeline and these events that we're talking about unfold the way it appears they may be unfolding. So in Ezekiel 38:8, we have this expression, after many days you shall be visited. Right? So after means later in time. Many days could be years. He says, you shall be, right? Or you are to be. These words are spoken with authority. It's like, it's an emphatic statement. You will be visited. Right? Someone will call upon and view the situation officially to send good or evil upon one. Right? That's what that means, visited. In Russia's case, they are visited with evil because in Ezekiel 38:4, God takes them prisoner with hooks in their jaws. And it could be that angels are sent and will do evil work and will be amongst men, and Russia will be unable to get away from them. So this could be an angelic influence upon Russia to cause them to rise up and do these things. It's sort of like when God hardened Pharaoh's heart. They don't really, they're instruments of punishment that God uses to punish Israel for their disobedience. In the latter years, right, that implies the end time of secular history, which we can see running its full course in Daniel 11:41 through 45. It says, you shall come into the land that is brought back from the sword. Or the people that are in this land were drawn along and led to this place to reverse their killing movements, led through reason and by distance from the instruments that have killed and shaped their lives. It's a land that once saw much fighting and killing, now to be changed into a peaceful land, unafraid. And it says, and is gathered out of many people. So this land that once killed others has taken into itself different types of peoples of other nations, having been purposefully collected to fill the land, bringing them all together as one nation. Against the mountains of Israel, which have always been waste. Now this is a picture of mountains, of a land where a large amount of Israel's people live, and not the mountains of the Holy Land of Israel. This land with these mountains were shrouded in mystery, neglect, and profitless for hundreds of years to the machinations of men. And then it says, but is brought forth out of the nations. Right? So it will have cause to become great abroad with different types of children from various lands. And it says, and they shall dwell safely, all of them. These quote-unquote many peoples will fear no outside aggression as they will become a powerful nation together. And as of yet, the United States, since it was formed, the English sacking of Washington, D.C. notwithstanding, we haven't been invaded. We've been living safely, far away, across the world. We have to remember that this chapter is giving us secular history of both houses of Israel, Judah and Israel. And Ezekiel chapter 37, it talked about these two memory sticks, and we have to keep that in mind in order to understand this. For Judah and his companions, and for Joseph and his companions. Because now we are remembering the whole 12 tribes. We are also faced with the question, where are they at the end time of our days? When Russia in Ezekiel chapter 38 moves against them in such strength as prophesied. The only thing that was identifiable in Ezekiel's day for these people was the land of Israel itself. Because all the tribes had been scattered and the Israelite skin was about to be peeled off. Right? We weren't recognizable as a people. Destroyed in the world of Assyrian Babylonian power. Then as the years rolled on, that peeling was to continue for them into other nations, losing their identity and characteristics as Israelites. We became unrecognizable. So Ezekiel 38:8 is kind of a word picture of Manasseh's great power, the USA, the United States, in the earth toward the end time when Russian power is also great. You have these two superpowers, really. So Manasseh's birthright, you see in Genesis 48, whose father Joseph holds the stick of strength and memory, has now been seen in Ezekiel to have come into effect because God granted it to be so through prosperity that we saw in Zechariah 1:17. Let's just look at Zechariah 1:17. We've referenced it a couple of times. Let's just take a quick Zechariah, was it? Yeah, Zechariah 1:17. It says, cry out again, thus says Yehovah Sabaoth, my cities shall again overflow with prosperity, and Yehovah will again comfort Zion and again choose Jerusalem. So Ezekiel 38:8 is very difficult to put into perspective in a few sentences. So we have to really enter in, we have to enter into and grasp secular history pertaining to this power of the United States of America, or this land where the eagle carried these children of Israel, headed by the sons of Manasseh's power in their ruling. During the translations of Daniel's prophecies in chapter 11, we looked at the power of Manasseh, or the United States, in verse 40, when the king of the south was the overlord, Eisenhower of the USA, going south from Britain into Normandy during World War II. So those are in the chapters that deal with each of the tribes of Israel and their migrations and their descendants. And we will cover that. We're kind of jumping around a bit, but we'll get into that at some point in the future. Now, Ezekiel, in Ezekiel, this picture broadens with the beginning of Manasseh's strength into the power standing foot of Nebuchadnezzar's dream idol, right? Which is again couched in secret words, but telling of his very beginnings being molded, the clay being molded, and how his restless killing eventually consolidated into safety for him and his people. When the key words mountains of Israel are read, many biblical students immediately jump to conclusions that the expression means that it speaks of the Holy Land of Israel. But this isn't always the case. The word mountains are used literally and figuratively at times for a vast quantity of steep, large hills, or they're also used as a great mass of peoples. Ezekiel 38:8 is historical prophecy, both secular and spiritual, made known to us in the earth, that the United States of America during the latter years is in power because of Manasseh's blessing, that he would be great, given by Jacob in Genesis 48:17 through 20. This blessing and these words in Genesis and Ezekiel 38 is the memory stick which is and has been written upon for Manasseh and some of his companions of the tribe of Israel. Now this memory must now be placed and taken note of before God and man, to be picked up by today's modern world to understand who they are. Now we're going to dive a little bit deeper into Ezekiel 38:8-9 and put these words into historical perspective. In the last years of the children of Israel's secular history within the territory given to Manasseh by God, called the USA, Russia, Gog of the land of Magog, will go into the North American territory. Because of the visitation that we discussed earlier of angels within Russia, evil men will think evil thoughts, leading peoples to destruction and the end of man's ruling power. The words, in the latter years you shall come into the land that is brought back from the sword, is indeed a very powerful descriptive expression covering a multitude of happenings in history. In other words, the USA within the continent of North America are going to be invaded by this Russian foreign power with all its hordes of other people, which is something that has never happened to them before, because its protection was always isolationism or isolationism from the other continents, right? They shut these warring factions of the old world out for their new world. The time factor for this happening will be the end time of secular history of man's ruling, given step by step in Daniel's chapter 11. It's called the latter years in Ezekiel and the end time in Daniel, which both expressions are alluding to the same thing, right? Eventually leading to the setting up of the kingdom upon earth of our Lord and Master, Jesus the Christ, who will be sent here by our Father. He is our real king, and he belongs to that sixth kingdom. Russia will enter this American land, which was brought back from the sword. So let's take a look at this phrase, brought back from the sword, in historical context. The short 250-year history of independence of the U.S. was one from a reliance upon other nations and from the terrible massacres of people by sword and gun of both white and Native American races. Whole nations of indigenous Indian peoples were given to the thirst for blood of the sword and gun. Hundreds of white people died in colonial or range warfare, which was once widespread and between cattle ranchers and farmers. There were Native American and white religious intolerance. Untold hundreds of black slaves died cruelly by the sword and the gun. The Spaniards and the Mexicans and the French fought with the sword, etc., against the encroaching English-speaking people. So this land was brought about through violence and war and death. The British and European stock fought each other with sword and gun, which eventually won for the ex-British colony of America its right to govern itself. Then, of course, the northern and southern states of the United States fought each other with the sword and the gun until their merger into one nation was complete and united under one flag. And not until the United States and the rest of Northern America stopped fighting with the sword was this massive land stilled long enough to take stock of itself, bringing itself back to the path of peace once more from the power of the killing sword. Right? And that's how you see this land brought back from the sword. Or as it says here in the ESV, restored from war. And when Ezekiel 38:8 says, and is gathered out of many people, he's forcefully describing how this great nation came into being. If ever there was a country that gathered many people from many lands, ethnic groups of nations, it's the United States of America. Her pronounced Statue of Liberty in New York Harbor welcomes the poor, the hungry, the displaced person, the wealthy, the dreamer, the desirous of all hopeful things. This well-known statue was given to the United States by the French people to commemorate the 100th anniversary of American independence in 1886 AD. It stands in the middle of the harbor and faces out to sea to meet the view of passengers on incoming ships. The spirit for which it stands is expressed in a poem in the main entrance to the pedestal, and reads in part, give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. Indeed, Ezekiel had it right. They are gathered out of many people. And into that land also went some of the tribes of Israel under Manasseh's birthright. And they, with all sorts of faces covering the past Hebrew Israelite features, whose countenance was now peeled. And let us look at this all-important expression, against the mountains of Israel, which have been always waste, in Ezekiel 38:8. This is not dealing with the Holy Land of Israel. This reference of the mountains of Israel can be states or kingdoms, can be cities or masses of Israel's children piled up to represent a mountain. It all depends on the context within the chapter that you're reading. In practical terms, there's no point in an enemy coming against a range of mountains as such, for the destruction of these massive stone edifices will bring no victory over peoples, only a lot of useless power spent by the attacker. Blowing up a hillside isn't going to help anything. It's not going to gain you anything, unless it's to open a way for you to attack somebody and take over their land. So here in Ezekiel, the mountains being spoken of are peoples. When the words which have always been waste are said about these mountains, this cannot be said of the land of Israel or Palestine itself. Though secular history can tell us that under Roman, Christian, Turkish, and Arab rule in this area, they turned this once fertile land flowing with milk and honey into a wasteland through bad neglect. In years gone by, from umpteen pulpits of churches, sermons have been preached that there have been more people pass through the land of Palestine with its mountains throughout man's history than any other place on earth, because it was the crossroads of three continents. During those many centuries of inhabitants who were ever building over past ruins of civilizations gone before, they leaving ruins here and there of great antiquity beneath the dust of that land. The mountains of Israel were places of refuge for those in danger, or the nomad, the Midianites, Israelite, Idumean, the Bedouin, etc. Then if this understanding of the Holy Land is correct, one cannot have it both ways. Either the mountains of the land in the land of Israel have always been waste, or they have not. And if not, then this sentence in Ezekiel 38:8 has another meaning than, these edifices, these stone, granite mountains of the Holy Land of Israel. The word waste means it is empty, desolate of civilization, with roots. It is also to damage, to dwindle, to pine away, and the land can resemble a desert or a wilderness. The act of wasting, or in the process of wasting, is something being spoiled or lost, bringing a gradual decrease in quantity, strength, and value. And now the trickiest part of all is when we look further into these words, these mountains that have always been waste. And we'll need further proofs in Scripture to fill out this picture. The picture of waste has been chosen to explain the state of the holy seed of Zion, or Jerusalem, in many verses, and of the land of Samaria when the house of Israel's 10 tribes were driven out. Though other peoples walked into their lands, took them over, and lived in their houses, yet it is still called wasted, because the tribes of Israel were no longer obedient or served God therein. And you can see that in Isaiah 51:3, Isaiah 64:10, and Hosea 13:16. Or it says, Samaria shall become desolate, for she has rebelled against her God. They shall fall by the sword, their infants shall be dashed to pieces, and their women with child shall be ripped up. Indeed, this punishment and desolation happened to the people in area called Samaria in the land of Israel, when the Assyrian overcame them. Samaria, or Israel's land, didn't actually become desolate to other peoples as started over the centuries, or stated over the centuries. Because it remains to this day with never-ending other nations of peoples living in Samaria or passing through that land. So the meanings of desolate and wasting have a deeper meaning than what appears on the surface. And so it is in Ezekiel 38:8, which calls the mountains of Israel waste. This quote-unquote waste description also refers to the state of mind and heart of the peoples of which we speak. They, in other words, are Scottish or sottish children with no idea who they are, right? We have no idea who we are. Nor do we have any desire to find the one true God because of pure apathy. We've been blessed. They are children whose real roots are wasted. Children who just don't want to know because that realization will shake them out of a long sleep. And it's going to bring them searching, work, pain, and derision. From Jeremiah 4:22. So let us read into other verses on mountains and people scattered on mountains. And we can see that in Isaiah 13:4, which says, the sound of a tumult is on the mountains as of a great multitude, the sound of an uproar of kingdoms, of nations gathering together. Yehovah Sabaoth is mustering a host for battle. So here we see that the noise of the kingdoms and nations of peoples gathered rise like great mountains into the air. And in 2 Chronicles 18:16, we read of Israel in the mountains. It says, and he said, I saw all Israel scattered on the mountains, as sheep that have no shepherd. And the Lord said, these have no master, let each return to his home in peace. We read in Jeremiah 31:1-2, of the dispersion of both houses of Israel into other lands in the world. And in verse 1 it says, at the same time saith Yehovah, will I be the God of all the families of Israel, and they shall be my people. And then in verse 2 it says, thus says Yehovah, the people who survived the sword found grace in the wilderness when Israel sought for rest. These are like the words which Ezekiel speaks to us, with the wilderness that Manasseh caused to find his rest, or to dwell safely from the sword in the continent of America. Is it such a hard thing for the children of Israel to understand these things? What makes my people so hard of hearing truth? Jeremiah goes on to tell us of the watchmen upon the mount of Ephraim who cry to Zion within the Gentile house of Israel to know truth. Indeed, this is what I'm trying to do with this study, and many other biblical teachers have tried to do over the years. In Jeremiah's chapter, we read of Jacob, the Jew, and of Ephraim in the Gentile in the last days, each as a separate category and entity of persons. Not all these persons within verses are humped together to be called Jews, right? Israel is separate. that so many biblical students believe and perpetuate in their teachings. They totally forget about the 10 tribes of Israel. We'll wrap up here in just a few minutes. And Jeremiah 31:10 goes further with their identification. It says, "Hear the word of Yehovah, O nations, and declare it in the coastlands far away. Say, he who scattered Israel will gather him and will keep him as a shepherd keeps his flock." So, hear the word of Yehovah, you nations, or unstop your ears, both nations of Israel, and declare it. Or to show plainly and openly and affirm it. Declare it in the isles afar off, in the coastlands far away. Right? And what are we talking about here? Ephraim. Where is Ephraim? Ephraim is in the coastlands. He's in the isles afar off. Many translators dealing with the books of Scripture translate the isles as coasts, which makes nonsense of prophecy. Is it such a difficult thing for men to come to terms with the isles indeed being the famous British Isles? In the last days, understanding by mankind should see the isles automatically would come to mind as Britain. And continuing on, he that scattered Israel will gather him through knowledge and understanding of God's holy book, the Bible, and keep him as a shepherd does his flock. Right? We Israelites have a shepherd, and his name is Jesus the Christ. Ephraim and Israel's other 9 tribes are quote-unquote Christian nations and are gathered through the knowledge of Christ. When Jeremiah prophesies that this declaration of truth is published in the isles afar off, these words are another guide to our understanding, because Israel is scattered from the isles to America, to Australia, etc. Indeed, very far off. So, brethren, we'll stop there for today. We'll pick up part 2 next Sabbath, where it starts to talk more about Judah. So we'll stop there. We will have our final hymn, and that will be, I have to actually pick one because I failed to upload enough hymns. So, if you will please stand and take up your hymnals and open them up to page 11. So we will continue this study next Sabbath, as I said, and so now we will have our closing hymn.